Sorry, these are just my...
Oh, you have notes. Oh, this is very impressive.
I've just got a terrible short-term memory, so if I think of any questions, I'm like, ooh, that's that one. But yeah, thank you so much for coming, and thank you all for coming, just for the video. This is Ali Sinclair, Alison May.
Hello.
And you've written 8 novels, is it?
Have I? I thought I'd written 10 novels.
You've written 10?
I don't know. I mean, they keep happening. I think I can do the maths out. I think I've written 7 novels and 3 novellas.
Oh, okay.
So it all depends how we count the novellas. I think I'm counting them as like a book each. I'm taking credit for all of them, so I'm saying 10.
And this is your latest 2?
Yes, so these 2 books, Season for Love and Christmas Season, are my 2 books that came out in 2023. Writing as Ali Sinclair, which is my third pen name, 4th name, including my actual real name, 3rd different pen name. And these are romantic comedies inspired by the idea of like a Regency social season, but very, very 21st century was the thinking behind those.
There's a lot of a Jane Austen sort of vibe to them.
Yeah.
Is that very different from your Alison May novels?
It is and it isn't. So as Alison May, I wrote 5 romantic comedies, or 2 romantic comedies and 3 novellas, depending again how we're counting. So I wrote 5 romantic comedies, and then I wrote All That Was Lost, which is, I think the publisher called it book club fiction, which just means fiction, essentially. Publishers like to categorize things, sometimes way beyond what makes sense. So of those rom-coms, 3 of them were Christmas novellas, which are probably quite similar in tone to these. And then the other 2 were inspired by Shakespeare comedies. Right. So my very first novel, Much Ado About Loving, as it's now titled, was inspired by Much Ado About Nothing, fairly obviously, because I love that story. I think Benedict and Beatrice are like the archetypal sort of rom-com couple, that kind of like they argue all the way through it, but you know that there's like something else going on there. And that, right through to like, When Harry Met Sally, all of those kind of golden age of Hollywood sort of romantic comedies, that archetype of they're kind of bickering and at each other, but we know there's something else going on under the surface. I think you can track right back to Much Ado About Nothing. So I think it's sort of the archetypal rom-com. Yeah. So I guess that thing of being inspired by other work and kind of classic romantic comedy is there throughout, but these have a very particular tone because they are really heavily inspired by that Regency idea and Regency romance. We have Regency romance author with us, is such a big genre in its own right, and I did the thing where 2020, not sure if any of you remember, slightly tricky year. And so end of 2020, it was that Christmas where up until like a couple of weeks before, it was like, yeah, you can have Christmas. And then they were like, you really can't. So it was all a bit miserable. And then we were supposed to be going and visiting family, and obviously we then couldn't. So we were home. And this is what my husband says, so I shouldn't go. So we were home, just the 2 of us, and it was really depressing. I mean, it was lovely in many ways. Yeah, they're not being able to visit family. This is going to be on the internet. I shouldn't say this. There were pros and cons. But it wasn't kind of the Christmas we'd planned. It hadn't been the year any of us had planned. And I did what I think a lot of people did that kind of between Christmas and New Year that year as kind of care for the soul, which was I watched the first season of Bridgerton like literally 3 times in about 3 days.
Oh, I did the exact same thing.
Yeah. Hot Duke. Hello. All good. And it was this little kind of just bubble of escapism and happiness, which I think is what romantic fiction in both books and movies and TV can kind of do. It was just this little kind of bubble where you know that you're going to go through an emotional ringer, but everything is going to be okay. Yeah. And sometime through the kind of 3rd rewatch of that, my brain went, what would that look like if you tried to set it now? And literally 40 minutes after I had that thought, I sent the pitch to my agent.
40
And
minutes.
literally, it's the only time I've ever had this. It was my 9th book, and it's the only time I've ever had an idea just pop into my head, fully formed, to the point where I was like, I can type this up now, I can send it to my agent. She went, I can sell that if you can write it. And pretty much exactly 12 weeks later, I sent her the manuscript. And it was so... I've never written anything like that before that kind of came that easily and that straightforward.
Like you've almost just found it.
Yeah, and it was just that moment in time, and it became then start of 2021 back into lockdown, and not like a nice summer lockdown where you can sit outside and listen to a horrible January lockdown. And it just, I think it became the happy place I put my brain. And went to this lovely little escapist bubble, and the story just flowed. And I went, 9 books in, I went, oh, I've cracked this novel writing thing. I've got it down now. And my agent sold it on a 2-book contract. And then writing the second one was like wading through treacle. So yeah, any of you who are interested in writing, never think you've cracked it, because the next book will bite you on the bum. When you think that, it will go, no, you really haven't. But yeah, that was where those books came from.
It's been a trend through all the authors we've had come in, that lockdown was a big sort of pick up the bum, changing moment for
I think it was for all lots of us in different ways, whether you're an author or not. It kind of pushed people to be at home who'd always been kind of out and active. It changed people's work situation. It changed how people were seeing their families and their friends. And all that is inevitably, if you're a writer or if you're someone who is creating work in whatever context, whether it's visual art, writing, film, it's going to change your output, because it's going to impact on your brain. And I know some authors who really, really went to the dark side during that period. They kind of embraced all the kind of grimness, and writing was their way of processing it. And I know some authors like me who went kind of completely the way, who went, no, that's too depressing. I'm just going to create a little sparkly place over here to live instead. But it's all just ways of processing what is happening in the world and in your life. And that moment, those were still ongoing. But the way that the world changed in 2020 obviously has an impact on kind of what you want, what you create, whether you intend for it to do or not. I remember seeing a lot of writers saying, are publishers looking for lockdown novels? Are they looking for stories actually about that? And I think possibly now, maybe, but back in like 2020 and 2021, no way. No publisher would touch that, because no one wanted to read about it. No. And possibly people do want to read about it now as a way of kind of processing that. But back then, so everyone was kind of talking about how does this impact on what we write. But it was very rarely as direct as, I'm going to write a book about what is happening. Because that was almost like too soon. For readers as well.
There was a similar thing after 9/11, wasn't there?
Yeah, very much so.
24 taking off and things like that, where people just needed to see terrorists getting murdered on television.
And it's a way of kind of processing those collective experiences. And I think writing and reading are ways of doing that on a smaller scale as well. If you're reading about bereavement or about falling in love or about lost love, these are all ways that we process those kind of more personal, individual experiences as well. And as writers, they're how we process those experiences too.
So do you find writing quite therapeutic?
It can be, but never in the ways that you expect, at least for me. So I very rarely set out to write about a particular experience that was kind of emotionally challenging or whatever. What I do is I discover I've written about it later when readers point it out to me. I go, oh yeah, there's a lot of psychological revelation going on there that I just ignored completely. Janet Gover, who's another author I'm really good friends with and have co-written 2 books with, she said to me ages ago, oh, all your books are about identity. And I went, no, they're not. No, they're not. What are you talking about? And she was like, how many main characters do you have who change their name? Right. And at that point, I think I was about 7 books, and like 5 out of 7 had main characters who changed their name or adopted a different name for some reason within the story. I was like, oh, yeah. Okay, all my books are about identity. I did not know that. And so I don't think it's conscious. I never sit down to go, I want to process this trauma or this emotion, but it's there because it comes out of your imagination. So how could it not be there?
Yeah, I love that sort of thing where it happens with filmmakers all the time. Where you look at the first half of their filmography, like Martin Scorsese just makes films about Catholic guilt and things like
Absolutely.
that. Steven Spielberg makes films about children of divorced parents.
Yeah, there's lots of children overcoming things
you wonder
in
if
his
they spotted
films,
it or if they just
and children thrust into the role of kind of independent hero, which is psychologically totally makes sense as being about processing childhood trauma.
I love that sort of thing because I love it when an author's personality and their experiences come through.
Yeah, but I don't.
When they don't mean it.
I don't think they can not, even if you kind of, because you never set out to do it, but you can. When people say write about what you know, I think people interpret that very literally sometimes, and they go, "Oh, well, you were a police officer, so you must write about being in the police." I wasn't a police officer, but as an example. But I think it's more kind of subconscious than that. Inevitably, you write about what you know, because what else would you write about? And you might write about what you know through the medium of an alien invasion.
Right.
But what you're actually writing about is being a child of divorce, for example, you know?
Yeah, look at there was a film called Arrival, which was about an alien invasion.
Yeah.
But it was really about grief and
absolutely
that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Which I think is cool. I like it when I feel like if you go too on the nose, it's a bit easier to write. If you want to write a book about grief, it's a bit easier to write a book where the plot is about grief. Whereas if you sneak it in at the end, it punches you, it's a bit of a surprise.
And I think as well, it's more reflective of how we experience emotion in life. Because one thing to take grief as an example.
Yeah.
When you lose someone, the rest of life doesn't stop. You still have to, make breakfast and get kids to school and do all of that stuff. So we don't kind of go on that journey where we go, this year is about dealing with grief.
Yeah.
But obviously it is about dealing with grief, but also whilst 1,001 other things are happening. And there's no reason in fiction why one of those things couldn't be an alien invasion.
Yeah.
It very rarely happens in real life, but
so far.
It feels like, as the last few years have gone, it feels like kind of par for the course for 2024, doesn't it? Alien invasion, probably, yeah.
Definitely. So how did you get into writing originally, if you don't mind me asking?
So this is an interesting one because the book launch for All That Was Lost, I told this story and my mother argued with me, which was awkward because basically I've always said, I wasn't someone who wanted to write when I was a child, because a lot of people say, I've always written. And I've said, no, that wasn't me. I came to it much later. Until I said that at a book launch and my mother said, yes, you did. I was like, what? Oh, sorry. So apparently, and I do remember this one, she'd pointed out to me, apparently when I was a kid, I was going to be a serious and important journalist.
Okay.
Basically, I was going to be Kate Adie. Do you remember Kate Adie? Yeah, goddess. I clearly discovered at some point in my adolescence that involves an unreasonable amount of getting shot at. And I was not down with that. Yeah. No. So that idea got kind of parked. And I went to university and did history. And I left, got jobs. And I reached a point kind of in my sort of mid-20s where I'd been in the same job for a couple of years. It was a good job. I really loved it. I was training manager for the Citizens Advice Bureau in Worcester. It was a fab job. I had so much fun doing that job. But I'd kind of got to the point where I could do it. Yeah. And I could do it fairly confidently and fairly comfortably. So my brain, as my brain tends to do, went, what next? And just by coincidence, I saw a flyer for a creative writing course it was a 2-year course that was running in Worcester. And 2 years felt okay. That felt like, okay, that's like a reasonable commitment. It was an evening class. So it's like, that's like a reasonable commitment. It's a bit more than just doing like a 10-week adult ed, but it's not like a whole degree or anything. Yeah. Only it turned out it was a whole degree. So I accidentally, this is ridiculous, I accidentally did a degree in creative writing because I signed up for this 2 years. And at the end of the 2 years, they go, have a certificate in higher education. If you do 2 more years, you can have a diploma. I'm like, I've already done 2 years. It's only 2 more. And then at the end of that, they go, if you do 2 more years and write a dissertation, you can have a degree. And I was like, well, I've done 2/3 of it. So I did genuinely accidentally do a degree in creative writing. But all the way through that, I was going to be a serious playwright.
Oh, right.
That was my goal. I was going to be a serious playwright. And for my dissertation, I started writing a radio play about Lord Nelson and Lady Emma Hamilton. which fell down on the fact that beyond the fact that Lady Emma Hamilton is an absolutely fascinating woman, I had no story. There was no plot, and it turns out that matters. So about 6 weeks before it was due in, I went to my dissertation supervisor and I cried in her office and went, I haven't got anything, I haven't written anything, I don't know what I'm going to do. Can I ditch it and start again? And she looked slightly pale. But she said I could ditch it and start again, but only if I did the novel option of the dissertation choices, because she thought that was the only one that was plausible to do in the time available. So I went to the pub with a friend and we got very, very drunk, and I cried a bit more. And she also got very drunk and went, what you should do, right, is you should write an adaptation of something, because then you'd have to think of a story. Right. Which frankly was genius at this point in time. So I wrote the beginning of what ended up being my first novel, based on Much Ado About Nothing, as my dissertation. And as soon as I did that, as soon as I kind of got out of my own head and stopped going, you need to write something serious and important, and went, no, you can write a comedy. It was just there, and I was like, I'm stupid. And I roll my eyes at people being like literary snobs about genre fiction, whether it's romance, whether it's sci-fi, whatever, whether it's horror. I roll my eyes at that, and I was doing exactly the same thing to myself. I was going, you have to write something serious and important. I was like, no, you can write something funny, which may or may not be important, but who cares, sort of thing. So yeah, once I'd got out of my own head, that was like, oh yeah, this is what I'm supposed to be writing.
So you ended up sort of accidentally doing novels?
Yeah, very much so. I accidentally did a creative writing degree, then I accidentally became a novelist.
That's amazing.
Some level of planning in life is potentially a good idea, I'm sure, but I never really pulled it off.
So did you always want to write romance when you started novels? Were you sort of
I sort of think of myself as a comedy writer who uses the romance as the kind of structure.
Yeah.
But I do love romance. A lot of the kind of films and TV shows and books I love are romances. So like I mentioned, getting obsessed with Bridgerton, still kind of obsessed with Bridgerton. Penelope and Colin's story this year, very excited. But things on Netflix like Heartstopper, which is a kind of LGBTQ teen romance series I adore. A lot of the movies that I comfort watch again and again are quite often romantic comedies. So it wasn't necessarily a kind of conscious choice to be a romance writer, but it's clearly kind of there in my DNA. And I like happy ever after stories. I like kind of knowing that the ending is going to be, even if it's not 100% resolved, is going to be uplifting. I like books and films and stories that leave you with that feeling rather than with that feeling. There's a place for both, obviously, but my kind of heart belongs to the stories that have that happy ending, and a lot of those are romance stories.
I guess it's more sort of, you can tell when people are writing things that they love as well. You know, I'm a big horror fiend, and you can tell when you see horror movies that are made by people who don't really like it that much. Because they always try and, you know, rebrand it as a psychological thriller or you know, they and you occasionally get
so if you're with a traditional publisher, you'll be signed by a commissioning editor, and then they may or may not be the editor who actually works on your book. So you will occasionally get a book that's assigned to a different editor, and like, because I am now sufficiently long in the tooth and bolshy to not get upset by it, you sometimes get an editor who isn't really a romance person, so I take it upon myself to teach them how romance works. But you kind of get like queries and things that you're kind of like, okay, you're not quite feeling this. And that's really tricky as an author, particularly when you're a baby author, because your instinct is to go, I have to do whatever my editor says. Whereas now I'm a bit more bolshy about just kind of going, this is my playing field. I know what I'm doing here. That beat is in the right place, trust me, sort of thing. But when you get someone who just doesn't quite love it, you can get that little bit of a kind of mismatch.
Well, they don't know the rule. I had this exact experience with my wife, who's a massive Jane Austen nut. And, you know, I'm completely an uncultured swine. I just, I watch Star Wars and all that. And she sat me down and made me watch Pride and Prejudice. And I tried to read it before and got about a third of the way through, and I just didn't get it at all because I didn't understand a lot of the rules. So when I read it, I thought the dad was hilarious. And she's sitting there pointing out all the little things like, he is quite funny, but he's also putting his daughters at risk of starvation and death.
Yeah, I mean, tiny details. But then I think as well, I mean, Jane Austen is such a smart writer because Jane Austen novels work on like so many different levels, because obviously there's romance that you follow through, but you also have that kind of comedy of manners element. Then you also have quite a lot of kind of satire and critique of some of the sort of norms and expectations of that time, some of which translates really well, some of which is kind of a moment in time and doesn't quite as well. But yeah, her stories have kind of stood the test and get remade so many times because they do work on so many levels, and like a new adapter or a new filmmaker can kind of come at them and focus on a different element or just slightly spin a character in a different way that isn't taking it away from the novel but is just emphasizing one particular characteristics. And you can watch, like, I mean, the Colin Firth, Matthew McFadden debate, but you can watch those two adaptations, and obviously they have a lot of common ground because they're absolutely from the same source material, but they just emphasize different elements and kind of focus on slightly different elements, particularly in the sort of more comedic parts of it. They're both really strong adaptations, but they just take slightly different tones.
With Persuasion, I think it was.
So Persuasion's my favourite Austen novel.
Recent one, which was a lot more Fleabaggy.
Which is, have any of you seen it? It's a Netflix adaptation of Persuasion. They've made some choices. And it is, so Anne is played by the woman from 50 Shades of Grey, Dakota Dakota Johnson, from 50 Shades of Grey. So that's a crossover straight away, which is quite interesting. But yeah, she talks to camera in the style of like Phoebe Waller-Bridge in Fleabag or something like that. It's very modern in its sensibilities, and bits of it really work and bits of it really kind of...
We'd recently watched the other version. I can't remember who was in it, but it's like where the main character is incredibly tragic and just, and it's awful. It feels terrible. And obviously it's brilliant. But you're just like, oh my God, this poor woman. And then you see the trailer for the new version and she's just sort of like winking at the camera.
Yeah, she's sort of, it's a really tricky one because I think Anne Elliot in Persuasion, have you read Persuasion? It's my favourite Austen. It's fabulous. But again, she's a character that she's very intelligent. Excuse me, she's very intelligent, almost kind of in the understanding of the time, almost too intelligent, sort of for her own good. And that version plays up that she's very knowing.
Right.
But what it loses is that absolute heartache. That she fell in love once, she fell in love for life, and he's gone. And then he comes back, but he's still gone. And it loses that just kind of absolute gut punch heartache.
Yeah, it's horrible. So what would you say is the sort of most important part of writing romance for you? The most important skill? Is it character?
Character is everything. Because a romance story comes out of the relationship between two people, character is everything. So it works when you as a reader believe that emotional connection.
Right.
And so I think people who don't kind of love romance and don't kind of get it tend to go, oh, well, it's very formulaic and, it's just the same kind of plot beats sort of. And in some ways, it structurally can be. But what has to be individual is those two characters and their relationship with each other. And you sort of almost, I nearly always find that when I'm creating a couple, I have one character who's there and is kind of fully formed in my mind, and the other who's a little bit hazier, but you can almost sort of back create that hazier character from working out what does the character I do know need? What is the piece of the jigsaw that fits?
Right, so if
them.
They need to be enemies at the start, you're like, who would this person
who would this person clash with?
Right.
And you can play around with that. So I've got one of my second novel, which has the main character in that, whose name I definitely know. Emily, come on, Emily. She's terrified of being alone. That's her kind of thing. And so you could create a hero who's very dependable and who's never going to leave her. Right. And that would fill that hole. but it wouldn't challenge her to get over that fear. So the hero in that book, who she, spoiler alert, totally ends up with, it's a romance, it's not really a spoiler alert, is quite adventurous. He's fundamentally decent. He's a good guy, but he's a little bit flaky. And because it's far more interesting for me to write about her learning that she can cope on her own, and then she can choose to be with someone who makes her happy, than just giving her someone who kind of plugs that gap. So you can play with that idea of what does the other half of this couple look like, to make it kind of more interesting or less obvious. But I think character is everything. If you don't have two characters that the readers engage with, and two characters who the reader believes would fall in love with each other, then you don't have a romance.
Yeah, because they're not going to be invested.
No, exactly.
Yeah. Do you have any advice for people like myself who try and write things which so I try and put a bit of romance into something that isn't a romance, for like you know, like an adventure novel, that sort of thing. And in books that aren't romance, I've noticed a lot of the romance tends to feel a bit of an afterthought. Yeah,
it can feel really bolted on. And you get that, you know, you see it in movies all the time, the action movie where there is, you know, he's going off and doing heroic things, and there's also a girl.
And just because there's a girl, you're like, okay, so they're going to kiss at the end.
So he's going to kiss the girl, but the girl's main role is to go, oh, be careful, and then possibly get rescued. And it feels bolted on. She only exists to give him someone to rescue. So again, it comes back to character. So if you have a hero character, I'm using that term gender neutrally, if you have a main character who is kind of on some sort of quest, is trying to solve some sort of mystery, is trying to achieve some sort of goal, there's a reason that they're trying to achieve that goal. It fulfills a need in them. So who's the person who fulfills the same need in them? Is a good question to ask yourself, because you already have a character there. The other way to think about it is to think about who is your kind of antagonist, who is the person who is putting blocks in this person way, because I think those can be really fun romances where you have that kind of you know, the master criminal who's kind of in love with the police officer who's trying to stop them. You get the Luther and Alice thing, Ruth Wilson's character in Luther, where she's a serial killer.
You're just watching it like, what are you doing? Like, stop it.
She's a serial killer, but sometimes she kills people who's upset Luther, which she sees as terribly romantic. He's a little conflicted about, but he gets past it. Worryingly quickly, he gets past it. But I think those can be fun as well, because then you're giving a kind of a romantic interest who is sort of an equal standing, kind of on the same footing, rather than that being that bolted on character who
like
just exists to go, oh no, be careful.
I've noticed you also work as a writing coach as well, which obviously, from your advice, you're very good at.
Thank you.
And I was going to ask how you work with people when you do your book doctoring sessions, which sound fascinating.
So I'm a writing tutor as well as a writer. And that was just a kind of really natural transition for me. Like I said, so I was training manager for the Citizens Advice Bureau. Then when I first started writing, I did freelance training for them. So I've kind of always taught, and I'm a qualified teacher. I only do adults. I've heard about children. No, I do adults. So it was kind of really natural transition to move into kind of teaching and coaching as well as writing. And so I do, you know, courses, I do manuscript critiques, all those things. But like, I'm really glad you've asked about this, because it's like genuinely my favourite thing to do is one-to-one work with developing authors. So I do one-to-ones by Zoom, and it's really, really individual. So it's really hard to give you a kind of what does that look like, because what it generally looks like is the first question is, what do you want to get out of this? And then everything flows from that. So sometimes I will be critiquing specific material that they've written. Probably the most common two things I do are either when someone's at the point where they've got an idea but they don't know how to make it work. We kind of brainstorm, we talk about story structure, and we talk about how to kind of build that from I've got this sort of idea into something that could turn into a novel. Or where people have got a first draft that is to use a technical term, a steaming pile of poo.
Oh yeah.
And how do you translate that into a novel? And it's so much fun to do. I'm doing book doctor appointments on a pay what you can basis at the moment. So some of my clients don't pay anything at all, which is fine. I can do you my rant about how financially exclusionary the publishing industry is, if you like, as a sidebar.
Please do. I have a question about that.
Well, so I'm doing book doctor appointments on a pay what you can basis, and some people pay my full fee and some people pay nothing, and most people pay something in between. That's all good. But it's genuinely so much fun to do, because in like an hour to see someone go from I have no idea if this works to I know what I'm doing now is just like so much fun. And I say this all the time, and it sounds like a joke, but it's 100% true. Fixing other people's books is an absolute piece of cake compared to fixing your own. Because when someone else sends me an outline of their book, I read only what is there. And when I look at my own book, I read what is there, what I intended to put there, what I put there and then took out again, what I thought about and never wrote. All of the intentions I had for it are all mixed up in it. So it's really hard to read your own stuff kind of objectively. If someone else sends you something, it's like a 2-page outline. You can look at it and go, you don't have a darkest moment. Your main character's really passive at the end, fix that. And it's so straightforward. And it's like light bulbs, light bulbs, light bulbs, so much fun. And then you come back to your own book and I'm just like, oh, why doesn't this work? And a lot of the time it's because your darkest moment isn't dark enough and your main character's passive at the end and you just told somebody else that. So I learn from doing it as well, because like I have like light bulbs about my own work, like while I'm talking to other people, I'm like, oh yeah, I've totally done that. So yeah, I absolutely love it. I sort of fluctuate between describing myself as a writer who teaches and a teacher who writes, because they just have like equal way. I can't imagine ever stopping doing it. Yeah,
it's amazing that you found something that is like a mixture of your old career and your new one. Like, brilliant.
It is odd, but my kind of helping other people kind of find a breakthrough is my happy place. And I do that around writing now because that's what I know about now. I couldn't do it around employment law anymore because I've forgotten it all. But it's just and to have where my desk is, I have next to me here, I have a shelf that has all my books on it, and in front of me there I have 3 shelves that have books by students I've worked with on them, and I'm just like so proud of those. Even though I had like some of them I had like 20 minutes input, some of them I read the whole manuscript and did a really big edit on them, but I'm like so proud of all of those people.
That's amazing. So do you get all sorts of novels to work on?
Yeah, I do. So basically I say that I'll work on any fiction apart from, I don't do children's just because I don't read it.
Right.
And sorry, I don't do horror just because I don't read it.
Yeah, no, fair enough.
So it's not about those genres being good or bad. It's just that like I don't want to sell someone something that isn't going to be good. And they're not my area of expertise.
Yeah, of course.
But yeah, basically any other fiction I will work on. So I do a lot of romance, a lot of commercial women's fiction, obviously, because that's kind of where I'm known. And then you pick up clients through word of mouth. And so, but yeah, I do a bit of crime, a little bit of sci-fi.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Do you notice do you get sort of a lot of chapter 1s to look at?
Yes.
Do you notice a lot of similar pitfalls that people have in chapter 1?
The biggest one in romance, and Janet, who I mentioned earlier, always rants about this as well. It's her like personal bugbear. But the biggest one in romance is the number of books that start with someone getting dumped by a partner. And there's nothing wrong with that, because it's a really common inciting incident to like a new romance starting, is you break up with someone and that sets you on a new path in life. But you just see it so often. And if I see it so often, agents and editors who are buying in that bit of the market see it as often as well. And the other one is that books that start with someone waking up.
Right, yeah.
Because the start of your day, unless you're woken up by like a bomb exploding or something, it's really unlikely that waking up and getting out of bed is the start of the story. The kind of first incident in the story is likely to be something that happens later in the day. So I have 2 chapters of you having a shower, eating breakfast, walking to work before the story starts.
Yeah.
So those are the kind of 2 things that I like nearly always just like line through and go, give me something stronger.
I did film at university, and that was like the number 1 rule for making student films: don't start with them waking up.
Yeah.
because everyone did.
And I say that with chapter beginnings and endings, don't have chapters that start with them getting up and end with them going to bed, because it's really unlikely that everything that happened in their day is actually part of the story.
Yeah.
So we don't need it. Put the story on the page. Don't put stuff that isn't part of your story on the page.
So you're a big fan of just sort of cutting out all of the non-essential stuff and getting it.
Yeah, and I've got a bit more chilled about that lately. I used to be very like, where does the story start? That's the first thing that happens on the page. I'll allow people like a paragraph of 2 of setup now. I'm very zen about it. But yeah, I see a lot, and I do it myself when I'm writing. You write like 3 chapters that are just you writing your way into the world and into the story, and it's it's important for the writer to have done, but then you ditch it. Or,
So are you sort of not as strict on structure as you used to be, or do you have?
I think
sort of
guidelines. I'm a bit of a structure nerd, but in quite a loose way.
Yeah.
So there's loads of different ways you can kind of think about structuring a novel. You can do things like Save the Cat, which is a whole system that has 15 story beats that you have to space through the book in a particular way. And that honestly just makes me feel a bit tired thinking about it. But I like the kind of basic structure that something happens that kicks off the story, inciting incident. Things get more complicated. We get to a moment where we don't think it's going to end well, and then it ends well.
Yeah.
That kind of basic shape works in pretty much all commercial fiction and in filmmaking.
Yeah.
And that basic 3-act structure, I mean, that is a 3-act structure essentially. That's ubiquitous in like Hollywood films.
Yeah.
And that story shape, there are no rules. You can deviate for anything, but I think it's a really good idea to understand that before you start to deviate from it.
Yeah, especially it's quite a cultural thing as well. I watch a lot of Chinese movies.
Yeah.
They have
which work in very different ways. So a lot of Chinese and Japanese filmmaking has almost sort of cyclical structure. And they talk about story structure in circles, which is really alien to a kind of Western and English language storytelling tradition.
So when you watch it, you're a bit like, hang on, where are you going?
Yeah, what's that? Where are we? What? And things shift from kind of one reality into another really seamlessly, in a way that kind of, in the way we tell stories, we'd need there to be a sort of mechanism for that to happen. So it's really culturally specific, but certainly in Western and English language storytelling, that kind of 3-act structure seems to be sort of innate, and it's there in fairy tales, it's there in folk stories, so it's in our kind of oral story tradition as well. So I think understanding that is a really good starting place.
I like the old 70s books about screenwriting, because they just do the 3-act structure and they haven't quite got to the complexity of like Save the Cat, where it's like, on page 10 you need this, on page 15 you need this. Which is a bit much.
But you see in movies, you see kind of those sort of jokes about 3-act structure. So in 3-act structure, you have a midpoint in the story, which is sometimes called the point of no return, and it's the point where basically there is now no way that your main character can get back to where they were at the beginning. They have to just keep going, and you see jokes about that. There's the Michael Douglas film where Al Pacino's the cop who's trying to catch him, and he's kind of gone on a bit of a spree, and I can't remember what it's called.
Is it Falling Down?
Yes.
Yeah.
And halfway through that film, there's a phone call between Al Pacino and Michael Douglas. And Michael Douglas actually says, I've reached the point of no return.
Right.
And screenwriting students look at their watch and go, yes, you have. it's bang on the midpoint of the movie.
I love it when they do that sort of thing. Fight Club does the same thing with the little cigarette burns on the film, where it's like, when you see these, you're about to move into Act 3, and then he just goes, boop, and you go into Act 3, which is quite fun.
Yeah.
So I was going to ask, in terms of self-editing and that sort of thing, I've read one of your blog posts where you were talking about how you believe it's entirely possible for authors, to an extent, to edit their own work. And do you have any tips on that? Because I suffer from the same thing that sounds like you suffer from sometimes, where you can't see the wood for the trees.
Yeah, well, I think we all suffer from that. So I think in terms of getting a novel from idea to something that is ready to send to an agent or editor, or to get ready to self-published, you either have to write a really good first draft, or you have to learn to be really good at self-editing. Those are your choices. Because no one accidentally writes a really good first draft just straight off with no work. So I don't write good first drafts.
Right.
I write horrible first drafts. The 2 books that I co-wrote, Janet, who I co-wrote with, was horrified. She was like genuinely quite stressed by how bad my bits were. And I was like, it's fine, I'll fix them in the edit. And she was like, she's just slightly palpitating at this. And I don't tend to plan a lot. If I plan too much, I have no interest in writing the book.
Oh, okay.
It's like I've sort of done all the creative work already.
You like to discover it.
Yeah, I like to discover it as I'm writing, but that means I write really, really messy first drafts. If you write really messy first drafts, you have to learn to get good at editing.
Right.
And it took a while. So my first book, I think I worked on for about 4 years over it. I think the draft that ended up going out on submission was draft 14.
Right. That's a lot.
Yeah, I've got it down to about draft 4 or 5 now, so I'm like way more on it. But the biggest thing is about learning to be dispassionate about your own work, learning to read it as if you didn't write it. The easiest way to do that is to ignore it for a couple of months.
Right.
Put it in a drawer and just don't look at it, write something else so you come back to it fresh.
Yeah.
If you're published and you're with a traditional publisher and you have a deadline, you don't have that luxury because you don't have a couple of months to spare. So I've kind of got it to the point now where I can finish a draft on Friday, start the edit on Monday, and that's enough that I can switch my brain into edit mode. But it is it's a different way of thinking. So writing a first draft is creative and it's very spontaneous. Editing is analytical. It's about evaluating it. It's about assessing it. It's about not thinking, do I like this, but does this work for a reader? Right. And I think about it as translating it from being something that's for you to something that's for someone else. Right. It's like turning it around to be like outward facing. Yeah. So yeah, it's trying to read it as if you didn't write it, read it as if you were just the reader. Yeah. And really silly things help with that, like read it in a different format. I always read on my Kindle when I do my first read through because it looks like a book. Brilliant, yeah. And that sort of slightly tricks your brain into not seeing it as a manuscript. Yeah. And then just remembering that I like that or I don't like that is not relevant. Right. It's, does this work? Does this bring the reader close to the character? The hardest thing to edit is comedy because nothing is funny the 7th time you read it. I bet, yeah. Nothing. So that's just a leap of faith. You just have to go, I thought this was funny when I wrote it. Yeah, it's the same I've found with like twists as well. Yeah. Because you can't be shocked by it if you know what's going to happen. You don't have that like moment. You just have to trust those that it will be there for someone who hasn't read it before. Yeah, and I'm terrible for writing. For like, I don't always write horror, but generally when I write horror stuff, I try and go for a little bit of sort of shock value with violence because it's monsters and what have you. Yeah. So you gotta. But by the 10th time you've read it, it's not that shocking anymore. So you beef it up a bit more, and then you show it to your wife, and she's like, "What are you thinking?" Yeah, you've over-egged this. Yeah. But that's brilliant. So you can read it on the Kindle and it doesn't feel like... Yeah, reading it in a different format is such a simple thing, but it does really make a difference. So if you normally work on screen, print it out. If you normally work like longhand, read it on screen, just find a different way of looking at it. Even just like changing the font makes a difference. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's brilliant. I have to try that. One of the things I struggle with is over-editing to the point where I'm like, I've been on the same book for years now. And it's gone through so many different versions where I've finished a draft and it's probably like the 5th draft of that sort of version, and now I'm like, oh, actually it needs this, this, and this, and this. Let's change the bad guy, change the location. Yeah, okay. What you've got there is a different book. How do you figure out when you should stop editing? I can feel Michelle looking at me because you've done my editing workshop, haven't you? You know what's coming next. So you just listen to music inside your head for a minute because you've definitely heard this next paragraph several times. I'm assuming you have music inside your head. That isn't just me as a permanent sort of going in the background. So yeah, editing is a process. And if you think of it as a process, then you know when to stop because you've reached the end of a process. Right. Okay. Going to do this in 2 minutes or less. We're going to teach you how to edit a novel. Okay. Come on. So you have to do things in the right order so that basically you then only do everything once. Because
Okay.
what happens when you start reading through a manuscript and start trying to edit it is you start correcting like spelling and specific wordings and things like that.
Yeah.
And you're potentially doing that on a scene that isn't going to be in the finished book. And that's just a colossal waste of time.
Right.
So what you're going to do is you're going to read it through once. You're going to not make any notes on your manuscript while you're reading it. You're going to have a notebook or a tablet or something over here, and you're going to make notes there. So you end up with a list of everything that is shocking and really awful about this book. And some of those will be like repeated words that you use loads of times that you need to tidy up. And some of those will be like, the monster isn't scary.
Right.
So there'll be a range of scales of problem. What you're going to fix first is anything structural. So that is anything that means you need to add a scene, delete a scene, move a scene, or really substantially rewrite a scene.
Right.
So really fundamentally change the point of the scene.
Yeah.
That's structural.
Okay.
You do that first because your goal in that first round of edits is simply to end up with all the right scenes in the right order.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
So that's structural. The next thing you're going to do is content edit. So that's anything that is a change to the story itself, but that needs dripping all the way through. So like the monster isn't scary enough, for example, you're not going to fix that by writing one big scene where the monster's really scary. It's got to pepper in all the way through. Yeah. So that's what you're going to do next. I call that layering, where you're layering something all the way through the manuscript. In romance, the really common ones for me are, I nearly always have a note when I edit says, this has no sense of time and place, because my first drafts sound like 90% dialogue. And then I have to go back in and put in paragraphs that say things like, by the way, they're in a cafe. So that's layering the stuff that is part of the story, is part of the kind of the content of the book, but you need to drip all the way through. You're doing that second.
Is that sort of adding in research and things?
Yes, that could be adding in research as well. And it's things like strengthening characterization, strengthening the sense of time and place, those kinds of things that are going to drip all the way through. Then you're going to do a line edit. That's where you're looking at paragraph by paragraph, sentence by sentence, and saying, is this sentence the strongest I can make it today?
Okay.
Not the best it can ever be.
Yeah.
Because next month you will be a better writer than today you. Is it the best I can make it today? That's your line edit. You do that all the way through.
Right.
Then you're going to proofread. Spelling, grammar, punctuation, page numbers, chapter headings, formatting.
Yeah.
When you've done all of those things, you have finished.
Oh, okay. Then
you just
sack it off you go.
Sack it off, start something new.
Right. Okay, that's really helpful. That's not what I've been doing.
That was quite bossy, wasn't it?
Oh, I like it.
Let's go, right, this is what you're going to do.
No, I like that, because honestly, mine started as a horror thing, and then it turned into a YA adventure novel. Then I gender swapped one of the characters, and now I'm trying to change the location and all that, and it's just like...
Okay, so there's a sort of stage 0 before you can do any of those, which is you have to decide what book you're writing.
Right, that's my issue.
Yeah,
is I wrote the book and then
that's the key thing.
change that decision afterwards.
Because you kind of... And that's one of those, it sounds really, decide what book you're writing, but there's no correct answer to that, because it is just, what book do you want to write?
Yeah.
And a lot of stories could be told in different ways. Like, if you've got a romance where something gets stolen, well, you could write that as a mystery with a romance subplot. Or you could write that as a romance where the thing that gets stolen is a kind of tiny subplot, Lots of stories can be told in lots of different ways.
Could be a war movie.
Absolutely. So that is that. But once you've made that decision, you have to kind of just make a decision and commit. Right. And accept that it's your decision now. It's not like this has to be the best and perfect decision. Because if you write it as if you wrote a horror story and that was a horror story, but your brain was going, but I think there's a YA adventure, then write a YA adventure as a different book. Right. You don't have to put everything in one book.
I think I suffer a lot from the old, because it's the first novel I've ever had to go at. I suffer a lot from the right, this has got to be brilliant. It's got to be perfect. And then it's taken so long, and you listen to lots of podcasts, and you sort of start second guessing yourself because you listen to people saying things like, if you want to be successful, you've got to look at the market. So then I'm like, oh God, I've got to look at the market. And I look at the market and I'm like, well, post-apocalyptic isn't selling. So
I know exactly why Michelle is laughing. Michelle is laughing because what do I say to you when you tell me you've bought another writing book?
I'll tell you to put them away.
I tell you to put them away and concentrate on writing, don't I? Advice is brilliant. I mean, I make part of my living giving people advice. It's brilliant. Advice is really helpful. It's really good to talk to people who are expert and to get other inputs. But none of those will substitute for writing a book. Right.
And I guess you give very direct feedback on things that are in front of you rather than...
And my role when I'm doing that is to help that person write the best version of their book.
Right.
Not to kind of shape it into the book I would have written or that I think would fit best in the market or whatever. It's to make it the best version of their story. So there is a point where you have to take the Neil Gaiman thing. So Neil Gaiman says, write the book that only you can write.
Okay, yeah.
And it's good to be aware of the market if you're going to try and sell it commercially, obviously.
Yeah.
But the thing that you are selling as a writer is your voice. It's your view of the world.
Yeah.
It's something that is innate to you. So don't edit that out.
Right. Yeah.
I'm quite bossy today, aren't I? I'm quite right.
I need it. It's brilliant. Yeah, because so much of the advice is sort of, this doesn't sell, that doesn't sell. But if it's good enough,
if it's good enough, and even the books that you can look at and go, oh, well, that's, because they're a celebrity or whatever. Okay.
Yeah.
5 years ago, publishers weren't saying, I would like a mid-ranking daytime TV quiz show host to write a cosy crime novel set in an old people's home. That was on nobody's wish list.
No.
And obviously, Rich Dawson's path has been easier because he already had a following in terms of actually selling the book. But that no one was looking for that.
No.
So when you go to panels and things with agents and editors and they say, what are you looking for? They always come up with things. And then they always say, but I'll know it when I see it. Yeah. Because actually they don't know what they're looking for until it arrives on their desk and they go, ooh.
Yeah.
So, you might be writing a book that makes someone go, ooh.
Yeah.
But they don't know what that is, so they can't tell you to write it until you send it to them.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, that's really helpful. Thank you. I'm going to stop faffing about with my...
Come on! It's part author interview, part therapy. It's fine.
In terms of sort of, I'm going to completely go back on myself, like sales strategies and things like that. Is that something you would recommend someone just starting to get into, like either self-publishing or traditional publishing?
So, if you're going to self-publish, it's your business.
Yeah.
You are author, CEO, sales manager, advertising manager, everything. So if you're going to self-publish, then yes, absolutely, you need to have a sales strategy.
Right.
Unless you are just self-publishing with a sense of, I'm going to put it out there. If some of my friends and family buy it, great. If some other people find it, great. I don't really mind. I just want it out there. Yeah. In which case, you don't need a sales strategy at all. You just put it out there and that makes you happy and it's all good. But if you want to do it as a commercial endeavor, then yes, if you're self-publishing, you absolutely need to think about sales, marketing.
You need like an author brand before you get going.
Branding, all of those sorts of things. If you're going to traditional publishing, it very much depends on the publisher. So traditional publishing isn't one big thing anymore. There are very traditional publishing houses who still operate in a ever so slightly Victorian sort of way. It's terribly old-fashioned, some elements of publishing. It's really weird. Where they're not necessarily looking for social media presence and things like that because they're going to put marketing budget in themselves. Yeah. And their marketing budget is going to outweigh anything that you can do. However, if you're selling to a digitally focused publisher who is potentially publishing 3 or 4 books from you in a year, trying to build that brand really quickly, they are going to have very specific expectations about how active you are on social media, that you have a kind of online presence, and you're really shooting yourself in the foot if you don't do those things.
Sort of put in that work.
So it's a really broad thing. And publishers are terribly, one of the ways they're terribly Victorian is that they don't often like to talk about it as a business. So when they have a book that's a really big hit, you'll quite often hear editors talking about it like this was just some sort of accident. So I had a conversation with the then editorial director of HarperCollins. I ran into her at an event, and it was just after Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine had come out. Do you remember that book? It was a huge hit. And I knew that was on her list. So I said to her, Eleanor Oliphant, that's doing really well. You must be really happy with that. And she went, yeah, it's great. And we're really pleased. And Gail Honeyman, the author, she doesn't really do any social media. She doesn't really do events. So we're really pleased with how it's gone. And then almost as an aside, she went, I mean, obviously we've put a lot of budget behind it. I was like, yeah, because that's why it's doing really well. But why not own that? Why not just go, yeah, we ran a really good marketing campaign and it's really paid off. Fair play.
Yeah.
Well done you. But they have that sort of slightly attitude to it. Everything's just lovely and things just sort of happen and everyone's delightful. Air kiss, air kiss. Yeah. No, it was a hit because you did some really good marketing, just say it. But with books like that, like she genuinely has basically no online presence at all, and that book was huge. So it can still work that way, but you would need to be with a big house publisher who are going to put big house money behind it.
The old, you can either do the work or spend the money kind of thing. All right. I've noticed you've got a brilliant YouTube channel.
Thank you.
Currently digging into with lots of good writing advice and everything.
Yes. So again, I started doing that. You can have my rant about exclusionary publishing is now. Yeah. Okay. So the way that the publishing industry pays money is still really weird. So a lot of the time you don't see any money until quite a long time after a book has come out. So you're potentially working on something for a year, and then it comes out, and it's like 2 years after you started working on it that you get any money. So you have to be in a position of some financial privilege to be able to do that.
That can't be your primary career or you'll starve.
It can't be your only income because you'll starve. And there's lots and lots of writing advice out there, and there's lots of courses, some of which cost thousands of pounds and all but promise publication or agent representation, which is lies. Nobody can promise that. Part of the reason that I do pay as you go, pay what you can, one-to-ones, but also that I do the YouTube channel, which is obviously free, is because it's advice that anyone can access without it costing you thousands and thousands of pounds. And then obviously I generate some income from doing that because people then come on courses and book one-to-ones with me and stuff because they've seen me on YouTube. So it's not wholly altruistic, but it's like on the more ethical end of what's out there for developing authors, hopefully.
There is an industry, isn't there, basically, of
absolutely.
Are you an aspiring author, give us your money and we will sort you out.
And also of publishers who prey on authors. And I see clients all the time that say, I've had this offer from a publisher, they're only going to charge me £2,000.
Right.
That's not how it works.
Yeah.
Run away. That's not how it works. There's a lot, because it's like anything. It's like, scam modelling agencies and talent scouts and stuff like that. Anything where it's someone's dream, you are susceptible to kind of putting your critical faculties to one side if you think it's going to make your dream come true. So
definitely, especially when it's you get so much rejection and stuff. Yeah. So if you get, if it's like pay $2,000 and you get an immediate yes. It's like okay.
Yeah. And a lot of them are kind of more nefarious than that. So you get the yes, and then you get the, well, you just need to contribute this much. Right. Sometimes in emails that say, we cover all of the costs of publication. If you want your book edited, that will cost this much.
Right. I'm terrible for the writing books as well myself.
It's an addiction. I mean, I tell people to stop buying how to write a novel books. I'm totally writing one, so I have no more high ground on this point. Mine you should definitely buy when it's out. That is the exception. Yeah.
I'm going to use your editing advice, so I'll definitely buy one myself. And on your website, it said that you also have done a bit of ghostwriting as well.
So I'm available for ghostwriting. I've done collaborative things. I've done a couple of things that sort of can't necessarily talk about in detail.
Sorry, I didn't think of that bit.
There were moments in a writing career where you sign a non-disclosure agreement, which then may or may not lead to a project. Normally they just lead to quite interesting gossip-filled conversations that you can't tell anybody about. So I can tell you about some other people's ghostwriting experiences that are like public knowledge.
Oh yeah.
I'm good mates with Sheila McClure, who's an American author who lives in the south of England. She's just written Shirley Ballas's book, and that's not a secret because her name is in the book, and she's credited as a co-author. But that sort of arrangement is getting more and more common in the publishing industry, that either a celebrity will kind of want to add to their brand with a novel with their name on the front, or a publisher will seek out a celebrity and say, we want to set a book in the world of ballroom dancing because obviously
Right.
that's on telly for like 3 months a year every year and it seems really popular.
Yeah.
We think this would sell more if it had Shirley Ballas's name on the
Right.
front than if it had Sheila McClure's
Yeah.
name on the front. So it can happen either way round, and I'm not saying which way it did happen in that
Yeah.
context, but that is getting more and more
I saw
common.
a hilarious interview with Anton de Beck.
Mm.
I think it was on This Morning or something, where he had a book out and they said, you know, you've written this new book. And he went, I didn't write it. I just...
Yeah, I'm not sure he's read it,
Yeah.
to be fair.
he had a coffee with a fella and then let the fella go to his garden shed and write it.
Yeah.
And it's like, fair dues to you for owning up to it.
Yep. and it's a brand extension
Yeah.
for someone like that. It goes alongside TV work, personal appearances.
Yeah.
It's another way that kind of fans can buy into that person's brand.
Yeah.
And yeah, there's lots of controversy in publishing about whether that's kind of gone too far, whether it's
Right.
happening too often,
Yeah.
whether ghostwriters or co-writers, as they're often called, are getting
Yeah.
sufficient credit, sufficient payment for
Right.
doing all the
I
work.
don't know how much James Patterson's partners get. But,
Yeah, so James Patterson's a really interesting model. So obviously hugely
isn't it?
prolific, but he doesn't write most of his books.
Yeah.
So what he writes, and again, I know someone who's written for him.
Oh, really?
It's a publishing industry mainly runs on gossip. So he produces an outline, but it's a really long outline. It's about 10,000 words, the
Okay.
outline.
Yeah.
And then you write to that outline, and he kind of checks back in quite regularly. You kind of have to send him
Right.
chapters and
Yeah.
things to make sure that he's happy.
Oh, so he is involved. then.
So he is very involved,
brilliant.
but he doesn't actually write
Yeah.
most of his books. But his co-writers are generally credited, so it's generally
yeah.
the covers generally say James Patterson in words like this size
Yeah.
and Bill Smith. But there's lots of authors who've used that as a kind of jumping off point to
Is that
then
how
get their own books.
That's
kind
how
of
they sort of get.
yeah.
Oh, brilliant.
Yeah, so he's.
fair
I think he's kind of a lot more upfront about how it works.
Yeah.
and he is quite involved, and because obviously he started as an author and
Yeah,
is now a
yeah.
brand who
And
is
his-
also
I've
an
read
author.
a few of his early books. They were really good as well.
Yeah,
the Alex Cross ones.
he writes a good thriller.
Yeah, and I think he's in his 70s or his 80s now.
He
so-
must be, yeah, 'cause
Right,
it's been going
fair
quite a
enough.
long time. And then you get some, so like he did one that was co-authored with Bill Clinton. I'm
Yeah.
guessing he actually had to write that one. I guess he was like, oh, you're even more famous than I am. I'm going to have to write the
Yeah.
book. Oh.
He's become the and.
Yeah.
I've had a little go at ghostwriting myself, but only on like a tiny, tiny scale on like Upwork and places like that. And I've noticed that they never cared about quality anyway. The qualifications needed were literally just like, are you a native English speaker?
Yep.
But the jobs on there have dried up in the last year because of AI.
Yeah. Yeah.
How do you feel about AI as a general, its impact on
Well, not super
writing
positive, if I'm honest. The issue with AI for me isn't so much about AI producing work that kind of takes over the market.
Yeah.
There is already on Amazon, sorry, mentioning Amazon, I feel like mentioning Amazon in a library is somehow kind of wrong. But there is already a big tranche of what look like self-published novels on there that are just book stuffed,
Yeah.
nothing. Scammy ways of generating money. AI will replace those and is already a
Right.
large part of those. Where I have issues with AI is that AIs aren't born, so to speak, knowing how to write a novel.
Right.
AIs are
Yeah.
trained in
By
what
reading
novels
other
look like
people's
by
novels.
reading other people's novels.
Yeah.
And at least two of mine
Really?
have been used in training AI.
That's mad.
That's my copyrighted material. I own
Yeah.
that. I haven't authorised it to be used in that way.
Yeah.
So it's not so much that AI is going to come and take our jobs, it's that they're using stuff we wrote to
Yeah.
teach AI how to come and take our jobs. And that I have quite cross about. And there's some big court cases going on in the US at the moment about use of copyright material
good.
in the training of AI, which I think are going to be quite interesting
Yeah.
to follow. Because I think that's where the kind of issue is. You can't control the future. You can't stop the sort of tide of technology.
Yeah.
No one who's ever tried has succeeded. But I think as a creator, having control over how your creations are used is the kind of, that's the basis of copyright law.
Yeah.
It is the idea that you own the stuff you've created and you get a say over what is done with it. And that isn't what's happening with how AI is developing at the moment.
Right, because the intelligent part of it is just that it basically just Googles things instantly. and then rehashes them, doesn't it? Like, it's not,
So
it's not thinking about it.
The way that, so large language models, which are the kind of most common, ChatGPT and things like that, essentially will produce something that looks like what the thing you've asked for looks like.
Yeah.
So you had lots of things where people tried to use them for academic essays, and it puts references in, but they're made up references.
Yeah.
Because it knows what an academic essay looks like, and it knows that an academic essay in this subject is likely to have references to these sorts of places. And so it looks like a good essay, but it isn't. It's an impression of a good essay.
Yeah.
It's like a picture of a good essay almost, sort of thing. So kind of that's where we are at the moment. But then you get into kind of what is art, what is a novel. It's a series of words that someone's arranged in the right order. And if it can learn to arrange them in the right order, then that's a kind of existential threat to human creators. Certainly in kind of more commercial fiction, I don't think we're anywhere near AI being able to write good books, but we're very close to AI being able to write books that people will put on Amazon for 79p and crowd the market.
Right. Yeah. So at the moment, it's just replacing like the bottom 5% of what's there anyway.
But
which is
that crowding out of the ebook market is already a really big issue. It's such a crowded market. Getting traction in that market is already really hard. And AI will, that kind of low grade stuff at the bottom of the market, AI will allow people to generate much, much faster, so it will grow much, much quicker, and that crowding out of the market is a really big issue. Yay, that was fun, wasn't it? That was a cheery bit. I feel like I should like a sort of tap dance section or something to like lighten the mood.
Does anyone have any questions at all? I've waffled enough, I think.
You're like, ooh.
I was interested in what you were saying about starting off. I'm reading a book called The Nightingale at the moment.
Yeah. Oh, I haven't. That's on my to read pile. I haven't read it yet. No spoilers.
The first chapter, I would say, I thought it was about an idyllic France. It was very slow, very pleasant, and I thought, suddenly war breaks out. Oh, hell, that's exactly. And those, but I almost put it down.
Yeah.
Those first two chapters. I realise now what the significance of those
Yeah,
two chapters.
they were there for a reason, but you don't know that when you're reading them, do you? Yeah.
I'm not bored, but it's just taking me anywhere.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's really interesting because I think there is, I slightly know Kristen, I might ask her whether she got any pushback from her publisher on that opening, because there is, I think, a real feeling now that thanks to social media and all of those different ways that we kind of consume media now, there is a feeling that people's attention spans are shorter. I don't know if that's true or not, but there is certainly that feeling amongst publishers. So I'm wondering whether her editor gave her any pushback on that opening, have said, no, you need to get into it quicker, because there is that risk that if people read the first chapter and aren't like grabbed, you just move on to something else. Yeah.
Sometimes you read a novel and it hits you between the eyes on the first page.
Yeah.
This sort of
Yeah.
it was lovely reading about it, but I didn't know where it was going.
Yeah.
This isn't what I anticipated it to be. And then
but then when you get into it, you're there. Yeah. And it's a real judgment call, because sometimes you want to kind of lull the reader in and then take them somewhere else. But it's how long can you do that without kind of just exhausting people's patience?
Yeah, when I look back at it,
Yeah.
And what then happened. But at the time, I didn't know.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's a tricky one.
Definitely see that in social media when you see movie trailers where they have a tiny trailer just before the trailer starts, where they have like a quick 3 shots from it, and they're like, right, now let's see the trailer. It's like, why are you showing me a trailer for a trailer?
Because we don't trust you to sit through a whole trailer. Yeah.
It's bad.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about your writing process? I noticed I was honestly very inspired when you wrote in one of your blog posts that when you start a novel, your workspace is very clean and tidy.
Yeah.
And then by the end, it's a bomb site.
Yeah, totally. Totally.
You have this impression, and it is honestly really, really nice to hear that your first drafts on.
Oh, they're horrible. Oh, they're so bad.
Didn't want to use the horrible.
They're so horrible.
Like,
No, it's fine. They are. No, I'm at like 42k. So a commercial length novel will be about 90,000 words. So I'm about halfway, about 42,000 at the moment.
Yeah.
It's terrible.
That's good to hear.
So depressing.
When you're like an aspiring author and you pick up the final book and you're like, this is brilliant. This
they don't come out like that.
Professional, and then,
Yeah, there's a process. So what's my writing process? I think it would be nice to have one. I should definitely get one of those. They sound terribly helpful. My writing process changes quite a bit from book to book, to be honest. I think that's another thing, if any of you are kind of want to write. I think sometimes, like I said, this book wrote really easily. I was like, I've cracked it. And then the next book did not play ball, so it changes. Yeah. But generally speaking, I get an idea usually at a point where I'm hating the book I'm writing at the moment.
Right.
And I have to stop myself from abandoning the book I'm writing at the moment and writing the shiny new idea. So I try and kind of write that down somewhere, capture it, put it over there with a pin in it. So usually by the time I start writing a book, they've had a few months to kind of percolate in the back of my mind before I start. I try, if the schedule allows, to give myself a couple of weeks of kind of playtime of what I call sort of noodling with the idea. So writing kind of character bits down, maybe writing like odd scene that may or may not end up in the book, just kind of finding I call it finding the taste of it, which sounds weird, but just the kind of feel and the tone of it. I'm not a big plot planner. So once I've got that, once I kind of have a main character and I have a kind of feel, I will generally just start writing.
Oh, okay.
And I try and write first drafts as quickly as possible because I hate them.
Right.
It's just a thing to get out of the way. So I aim to write a first draft in about 7 to 8 weeks.
Oh, okay. That's really fast.
It's about 10, 11k a week.
Yeah.
My first drafts usually come up short. They usually come up about 70 and then they grow when I edit. But it is just because I just need to get it over with. Right. Because it won't be good.
Yeah, I found I did NaNoWriMo and that really helped just because it's, you set your daily word count and you just have to hit it whether the words are good or not. Yeah. So I'm typing it being like, this is terrible, this is terrible.
But you just keep going.
And then, eventually you'll get to a scene and you're like, oh, that was quite a good one. But then you keep going, it's terrible.
Yeah, you have like the moments of sunlight where you're like, oh, I'm on it now, this is all going fine. And then the next scene is just like, no, this is bobbins again. So try and write first draft as quickly as possible because where I do most of my work is in the edit. Right. That's when I turn it into something that might plausibly be readable by someone else. So like the book I'm writing at the moment, I'm at 42,000 words. I'm pretty confident that 20, 25 of them are just going. Oh, okay. They're not right. It's stuff I needed to know about the characters, but the tone is wrong. It's far too bleak. It needs to be more joyful, more uplifting. Yeah. I've got characters who have only just appeared on the page who clearly needed to appear in the first 10k. So all of what I've written at the moment will be significantly changed. I suspect the majority of it will just go. So when I say I write shocking first drafts, that's how shocking. Right. And it's when I rewrite that I do most of the work. So I generally spend longer editing than I do writing a draft. Yeah. So this book has to be delivered on the 1st of June. I'm aiming to finish the draft by the end of probably about another 3 weeks on the draft. Yeah. And then I should have time to ignore it for a couple of weeks this time, which I don't always have. But then basically all of April and May, I will do at least 2 solid months of revision, which will be, probably slightly longer than I spent writing the draft. That's brilliant. And this is a book that I sold off a pitch, so it's already contracted, so it has to be delivered on that date. And this is the first time I've done this, actually, for a whole contract. So generally, you write a book, you send it to the publisher, they want it or they don't. And sometimes they'll offer you a 2-book contract and then you write the second one to their deadline. This is a 3-book series that I sold off a pitch, so I hadn't written any of the books when I sold it. Yeah. So all of them are being written to a deadline, which is a little bit different because normally at least the first book you have time. Right. So if it all goes horribly wrong, you can go back to start again and do that. I don't have that this time. It kind of has to work. It's very high pressure. Yeah, so it's a little bit more pressure, but it's fine. It's doable. It was, I know what the benefit of selling it off a pitch is that I know exactly what the publisher wants. Oh, okay. So hopefully I can get it there. But that's sort of roughly my process. Horrible first draft. Get it over as quickly as possible. The work is done when I edit.
Brilliant. Oh, that's really handy to know because you just get the impression from you know, from TV shows, movie interviews, when you see authors talking about their books, they're generally just like, oh yeah, I had this in mind the whole time. And
Yeah,
like, no.
Oh, sometimes you will have had something in mind the whole time, but it doesn't appear on the page until you read it. Because you realise that, like, the thing that was the core of the story, you have actually failed to put on the page because you knew it so well that you just sort of assume it's there.
Yeah.
Then you read it back and go, no.
My issue is I spend too much time faffing around with backstory, and then I'm trying to do little info dumps throughout the book, and I'm just like, I'm either putting too much there, and it's like, hang on, nothing's happened. No, the character hasn't done anything for 5 pages. Did you just telling me a flashback or whatever?
Yeah.
Or,
so the thing with information, giving information to the reader, is you ask yourself 2 questions. First is, does the reader need to know this?
Yeah.
A surprising amount of time, the answer is no. And then, do they need to know it now?
Right. Yeah.
And unless you get a yes to both of those, it isn't on the page.
Yeah.
If you get a yes to both of those, you then say, what's the most dynamic way I can communicate it?
Right.
And usually it's by having a character do something that shows it.
Yeah.
So if you need your reader to know that your character is terrified of fire, you set fire to something.
Right.
You don't write a long section about how when they were a child there was this fire and it was terribly traumatic.
Right,
You just set fire to something,
Yeah.
you know? So it's those 3 things. Does the reader need to know it? Do they need to know it now? And if yes to both of those, what's the most dynamic way I can show them it?
Yeah.
I'm really bossy, aren't I?
Oh no, that's brilliant.
So like,
I just watched this film yesterday, and it like paused for a backstory moment, which was about 10 minutes long, and it was amazing, and it looked cool. But it's a bit like, well, the film's not really going anywhere now. You're just kind of filling us in on what's happened 20 years ago.
Yeah.
You know, which I always have an issue with stories that start when they were children. I'm just like, come on, I've come to see a Batman film.
Superhero, particularly Batman, they've gone very backstory heavy recently. You've got to everyone has to have a childhood trauma that they're working through. You're like, no, just go and punch some bad guys. Get on with it.
That's does anybody else have any other questions at all, or no? But that's been really useful. I'm honestly going to watch this back and take notes, especially on the editing
all the bits I just shouted at you about how to edit a book.
I need it. Because I just feel like I'm trying to second guess what would be successful, and it's just not what I originally
Like the book
wanted.
you want to write.
Yeah. That's brilliant. And decisions up front.
Yes.
Yeah. But thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much. And have you got some of your books for sale?
Yes, and the books that are on the table here are for sale. I've also got flyers about the tutoring things I do if any of you are developing authors. Books are £6 each, or a tenner if you buy 2. Or if you already have one of my books, I'm happy to sign them. Or if you just want to chat, I'm also happy to chat. If you just want to run away from the scary talky lady, also cool. You have many options, is what I'm saying.
And for the video, where can people find you online?
People can find me online mostly as Alison May. So I'm at Alison May on Twitter and Instagram. I'm Alison May on Facebook. You can also find me on YouTube at Alison,
Brilliant.
where I talk about writing and publishing and all that sort of stuff.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.